Karoline Leavitt sat with the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. The bright studio lights reflected faintly in her eyes as she glanced across the table at the panelists arranged with poised pens and tightened lips. They were seasoned, smug, and certain, liberals with the usual arsenal of crafted talking points, snide asides, and the comfort of the majority. She was the guest, the conservative firebrand invited with half expectation and half condescension, the kind that begged for a televised spectacle. The host, a silver-haired figure with a practiced smile, cleared his throat and set the stage with the gleaming tone of objectivity. "Karoline, let's begin with the basics," he said, voice smooth as silk dipped in steel. "Your recent comments about government overreach have stirred some controversy. Some say dangerously misinformed. Care to clarify for us before we dig in?" The smirk was nearly invisible, but it lingered in the silence that followed, like a cue for the panel to pounce. Karoline tilted her head slightly and smiled, but there was a fire behind her expression that seemed to grow with every breath she took. "Sure," she said, her voice firm, calm, and deadly precise. "I said the government has gone too far. I said it's not their job to parent our children, spy on our bank accounts, or inject themselves into every inch of our lives. That's not controversial. That's the Constitution." One of the panelists, a professor with thick glasses and a reputation for academic verbosity, leaned forward with a scoff. "But the Constitution is a living document, Miss Leavitt," he said with patronizing warmth. "Interpreting it rigidly ignores the complexities of our evolving society. You're clinging to a past that no longer reflects today's values." Her eyes locked on his like steel against glass. "And you're justifying government control with flowery language," she said, her voice sharpening. "The Constitution doesn't evolve to suit the comfort of those in power. It protects the rights of the individual, especially when those rights are inconvenient to the elite." A second panelist, a former journalist with years of evening news under his belt, interjected with a theatrical sigh. "You talk about government overreach like it's some dystopian nightmare, but where were your complaints when your party expanded surveillance or pushed anti-protest laws?" Karoline turned toward him without flinching. "I complain no matter who does it," she shot back. "Power isn't partisan. If the GOP oversteps, I call them out. But right now, it's your side pushing lockdowns, censorship, IRS expansions, and digital currency surveillance. Let's not pretend the hypocrisy is one-sided." There was a beat of silence, heavy like a held breath. The host cleared his throat, again, subtly shifting in his chair. "Let's stay civil," he said, though his tone betrayed a flicker of irritation. "Karoline, do you really believe the media is intentionally suppressing voices like yours?" She leaned forward just slightly, and it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. "Not just suppressing, smothering," she said. "You cut off conservative voices mid-sentence, slap misinformation labels on opinions you don't like, and call dissent dangerous. You hide behind algorithms and talking heads to create an illusion of consensus. That's not journalism. That's propaganda." A third panelist, younger and less hardened by the years, chuckled nervously. "Come on," she said. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" Karoline looked at her, not with malice, but with the unblinking honesty of someone done pretending. "You don't need to jail someone to silence them. You just have to convince the world their words aren't worth hearing." The professor opened his mouth, ready to unleash a dissertation, but Karoline cut through the air again before a syllable could escape. "You don't argue ideas anymore. You dismiss people. You call us racists, extremists, science deniers. Not because you believe it, but because it's easier than engaging in real debate." The table grew quiet. The usual rhythm of banter and rebuttal had been broken. There was something deeper in her voice, something that echoed long after her words stopped. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't raging. She was simply unmoving. Then she turned to the camera. Her eyes didn't waver. "You've convinced half the country that questioning the government is treason, that wanting secure borders is bigotry, that asking for fiscal sanity is cruelty. But the truth is, you're scared. Scared of people waking up. Scared of losing control. Scared of a nation that still believes in freedom more than it fears your disapproval. The silence this time wasn't just uncomfortable, it was seismic. The host glanced nervously at the producer off camera. Someone fidgeted with a pen. No one jumped in. No one laughed. No one even tried to pivot. And that was only the beginning. Karoline didn't ease back into her seat like someone who had finished speaking. She stayed there, forward, steady, as if daring anyone to challenge her, not with insults or applause, but with substance. The panel, usually a whirling storm of overlapping voices, sat disarmed, like a play missing its final act. For a moment, all that filled the studio was the soft hum of lighting equipment and the hollow beat of restraint. The younger panelist finally found her voice, albeit wrapped in a fragile shell of forced composure. "You talk about freedom," she said, brushing back a strand of hair from her face. "But your idea of freedom seems to overlook the vulnerable. What about healthcare access? What about climate change? What about protecting communities from disinformation and hate speech?" Karoline's expression didn't shift, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something deeper. "Freedom isn't the absence of danger," she said quietly. "It's the presence of choice. You don't protect people by turning the government into their keeper. You protect people by empowering them, by letting them speak, decide, live, even if that life looks different than what you think it should." The older journalist leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. "But what you call choice, often, leaves people behind. What's freedom to a mother working 3 jobs without health care? What's liberty to someone drowning in debt because your party gutted student loan relief?" Karoline turned to him, unshaken. "You assume government solutions are the only compassion we have. But I've seen communities lift each other without waiting for a bureaucrat's permission. I've seen churches feed families, neighbors pay each other's rent, small businesses rally around the broken. You trade freedom for promises that never come, and you call that justice. I call it abandonment disguised as progress." There was a shift in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but like the subtle creak of something cracking. The host glanced again at the clock, but he didn't interrupt. Maybe he wanted to. Maybe he knew he couldn't, not without making it obvious. The professor adjusted his glasses with a sigh of long-honed disdain. "Karoline, with all due respect, this kind of rhetoric is what's polarizing America. You frame disagreement as tyranny and treat nuanced debate as betrayal." Her laugh came then, soft and short, more like an exhale laced with disbelief. "Polarization didn't start because people like me spoke up. It started because you stopped listening. You want unity? Then stop pretending your version of truth is the only one allowed in the room." The younger woman shook her head. "That's not true. We welcome dialogue. We just don't accept dangerous narratives, lies that could cost lives, that divide communities, that..." Karoline's voice rose, not in volume, but in clarity. "Dangerous to who? The people in power? The narratives you don't like become dangerous the moment they threaten the comfort of the status quo. But I'll tell you what's actually dangerous: erasing dissent, calling half the country domestic terrorists because they question authority, rewriting words like patriotism and truth until they only mean loyalty to one party." The host leaned in then, fingers laced together, his voice coated in faux neutrality. "Karoline, let's talk January 6th. Many say that kind of rhetoric, patriotism, resistance, questioning authority, is exactly what led to that tragedy. Don't you feel some responsibility in fanning those flames?" She didn't blink. "No," she said, the word like a strike of a bell, "because I've never once defended violence. I've condemned it clearly, repeatedly, but you only bring up January 6th when you want to shame people into silence. Where's your outrage for the months of riots in 2020? Where's the accountability for politicians who said, make them uncomfortable in the streets? You don't get to choose which mobs are justified." There it was again, that silence. Not stunned, not confused. Just quiet. The silence of realization, of someone watching the narrative slip just far enough from their grip that they couldn't catch it again without bearing the bias they'd hidden so carefully. And Karoline, sensing it, didn't retreat. She leaned in further, heart burning, voice unwavering. You want to heal the country? Then stop pretending unity means surrender. Stop gaslighting people who see the cracks in the system. Stop demanding loyalty to a narrative instead of loyalty to the truth. The professor opened his mouth, closed it again. The host finally exhaled. Let's take a break, he said, his voice thinner than before. We'll be back after this. But the moment wasn't done. Not for Karoline, and certainly not for those watching. As the studio lights dimmed slightly and the red on-air sign clicked off, the atmosphere didn't relax, it tightened. The panelists reached for their water, shuffled notes, and looked everywhere but at Karoline. The host glanced at his phone, but his thumb hovered over the screen, unmoving. It wasn't the break they were used to, that familiar pause where snarky comments could be muttered under breath, where laughter could be shared at the expense of a guest now muted. This break was filled with a weight no one dared acknowledge. Karoline stayed still, her posture perfect, her eyes tracing the silence like a hunter watching prey retreat into the tall grass. The silence didn't bother her. It empowered her. She had long learned the art of stillness, not as submission but as strength. Let them regroup. Let them search for new tactics. She wasn't here to play their game. She was here to dismantle it. One of the interns, no more than 22, walked over to refresh her water and hesitated mid-pour, looking at her as if she were something he hadn't expected, a person, not a caricature. Their eyes met for half a second. He nodded, barely perceptible, then turned away. When they returned from the break, the show's tone had shifted. The host's voice held a subtle edge, like velvet drawn over steel. We're back, he said, leaning forward. Karoline Leavitt joins us today, and she's certainly not holding back. A faint, manufactured chuckle followed. Let's pivot to policy, specifically, education. Karoline, you've criticized what you call ideological capture in schools, but don't you think children deserve to learn a more inclusive history? She nodded slowly, not out of concession, but out of preparation. Absolutely, she said. They deserve to learn the full truth, the brilliance of the Constitution and the brutality of slavery, the genius of the founders and the cost of their contradictions. But what's happening now isn't education, it's indoctrination. You're not teaching kids to think critically. You're teaching them what to think. You shame dissent. You erase context. You reduce centuries of complexity into slogans and villains. The younger panelist jumped in, eyes flashing. So you think racism doesn't exist? You think we shouldn't teach children how systems have oppressed people? Karoline looked at her, the way someone might look at a friend who had been lied to their entire life. Of course racism exists, she said, and we should teach that. But we should also teach progress, teach agency, teach that you're not defined by victimhood. Teach that your skin color is not a moral compass. Teach that history is something you study, not something you inherit guilt for. The professor's fingers drummed against the desk. But the systems are made of people, she said, cutting through his preamble. People who can change, who have changed. But when you tell kids they're either oppressors or oppressed by default, you're not dismantling systems, you're building new cages. The journalist leaned back, arms crossed. You're using big words to defend a dangerous ideology. You want to strip diversity programs, dismantle equity initiatives. That's not protecting freedom, it's protecting privilege. Karoline's voice softened, which somehow made it hit harder. Privilege, she said, is growing up in a country where you're allowed to say whatever you want, even if it's wrong, even if it offends, even if it challenges the person next to you. And yet, the minute someone like me speaks, I'm told I'm dangerous. Why? Because I won't kneel to your version of compassion? Because I believe in equal opportunity, not equal outcomes? The younger panelist clenched her pen so tightly the plastic squeaked. You're simplifying issues that are deeply painful for millions of people. And you're complicating truth, Karoline replied. Pain isn't policy. Trauma isn't governance. We can acknowledge hurt without creating hierarchies of oppression. We can lift people up without tearing others down. The host exhaled slowly, as if trying to summon calm. But surely you see the value in ensuring marginalized communities are protected, that we take deliberate steps to correct decades, centuries of inequality? I do, she said. But equity isn't about protection anymore. It's about punishment. You've taken the scales of justice and turned them sideways. That's not balance, that's vengeance. The panel fell quiet again. A silence that wasn't planned, a silence that couldn't be edited out. And across the country, in living rooms, in cars, in break rooms and buses and college dorms, viewers sat with that silence. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some sat straighter. Some, for the first time in a long time, listened without distraction. Karoline didn't blink. She had more to say, and they all knew it. Karoline could feel it, the shift not just in the room, but in the air around her, like the first tremor before an avalanche. The panel was no longer debating. They were recalibrating, looking for handholds on a cliff that was beginning to erode beneath them. The illusion of control had cracked. Now they were searching for safer ground, but Karoline had already lit the match and tossed it over her shoulder. The host straightened his papers with unnecessary care. "Let's move on," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Gun control. Another topic you've taken a firm stand on. Some would say extreme. After so many tragedies, why oppose what many call common sense reforms?" Karoline didn't hesitate. Because common sense shouldn't be a euphemism for control. You push universal background checks, red flag laws, magazine bans, all with the promise of safety. But they never deliver it. The people who obey laws aren't the ones committing mass shootings, and the people who want to protect their families are the ones being punished. The journalist raised an eyebrow. "So we do nothing, just accept mass shootings as a cost of freedom?" She looked him dead in the eyes. "We don't do nothing. We secure schools. We address mental health. We fund law enforcement, not defund them. But stripping rights from law-abiding citizens won't stop evil. It just disarms the innocent. Evil doesn't follow laws. Evil doesn't care about your paperwork, and evil always finds a way." The professor leaned in, voice low and measured. "But studies show gun restrictions work in other countries. Australia, for instance. Japan. Why is America so different?" "Because America was built on the belief that the people hold the power, not the government," she replied. "Our Constitution wasn't designed for convenience. It was designed for protection, from tyranny, from overreach, and yes, from the idea that safety is more important than liberty. Our uniqueness is not a flaw, it's a feature." The younger panelist, who had grown more restless with each exchange, scoffed. "This obsession with guns, it's pathological. No one's trying to take away your rights, just make sure they don't come at the cost of someone else's life." Karoline turned to her, slowly, deliberately. "You say no one's taking our rights. Then explain to me why peaceful gun owners are treated like criminals, why banks flag gun store purchases, why politicians brag about buyback programs. How do you buy back something you didn't sell? Why people who've never broken a law have to beg for permission to defend themselves?" There was no answer, not immediately. Only a visible recoil, small, but telling. The host pressed on, trying to regain momentum. "Let's turn to your stance on the border," he said, his voice losing its polish. "You've called the current situation an invasion. Many have said that language is inflammatory, even xenophobic." Karoline's face didn't flicker. "Words matter. And when hundreds of thousands of people cross our border illegally, every month when cartels control the flow of humans and drugs, when Americans are dying from fentanyl that pours across unchecked, invasion is a precise word. It's not about race, it's about sovereignty." The journalist leaned forward, trying to corner her. "But what about the children? The families fleeing violence? Are you saying they don't deserve a chance?" Her voice softened, but her tone didn't waver. "I believe in compassion, but I also believe in law. We have a system, a legal pathway. What's happening now isn't immigration. It's chaos, and it's hurting everyone. Migrants are dying, women are trafficked. Americans, are overdosing. There's no dignity in an open border, only disaster. The younger panelist looked visibly emotional now. Do you even care about the human cost of your policies? Karoline's answer came quietly. I care enough to want a solution that actually works, not one that looks good in headlines and leaves bodies on both sides of the border. Another silence, a deeper one. Even the professor sat still, scribbling nothing. Karoline looked around the room, her voice slow now, measured. You keep asking why I won't apologize for these beliefs, why I won't compromise. But what you don't understand is that compromise has already brought us here. We compromised on speech, on privacy, on faith, on the right to defend ourselves, on our borders. Every time, we gave a little ground for the promise of peace, and all we got was more control, more division, more fear. Her eyes scanned the table one last time. I'm not here to debate what freedom should mean. I'm here to remind you what it does mean, and I won't water that down so you feel more comfortable. The host looked down at his notes again, but they were useless now. None of their prep had accounted for this. For her. For truth wrapped not in slogans, but in certainty. The camera's red light was still on, and Karoline, unbothered, sat tall. Beneath its glare, unmoved, unbroken. She was only halfway done. The host adjusted in his seat, the discomfort no longer subtle. His collar seemed tighter now, his carefully curated demeanor unraveling thread by thread. He reached for control the only way he knew how, by shifting tone, by playing the moderator who could still command the narrative. Karoline, he said, voice thin as paper, many would say your rhetoric divides more than it unites. Don't you think we need bridge builders, not fire starters? Karoline looked at him with something close to pity, but not softness. Truth isn't a fire unless the lies are kindling, she said. You don't bridge a gap by pretending it's not there. You cross it by being honest about how wide it is and how we got here. You think people like me are the problem? Because we refuse to lie to keep the peace. But real unity can't be built on silence. The younger panelist leaned forward, her voice cracking just slightly. But people are hurting. Women losing rights, LGBTQ+ communities under attack, book bans. Karoline cut in, not harshly, but with the weight of undeniable calm. Women lost rights the moment you stop defining what a woman is. You can't fight for women's issues. And pretend biology doesn't matter. As for the LGBTQ+ community, no one is attacking them. What we are doing is pushing back against an ideology that demands children transition before they can spell the word. That demands pronouns replace truth. That demands compliance in place of respect. The panelist looked stunned. So you're okay with discrimination? Karoline's voice dropped, steady and cold as winter air. I'm not okay with forced speech. I'm not okay with ideological coercion in schools, in HR departments, in government policy. I believe in protecting every person's right to live free. But that includes those who don't want to be reprogrammed into saying 2 + 2 is 5 just because someone's feelings might get hurt. The professor, who had stayed unnervingly quiet, finally spoke. His voice was slower now, more calculated. And what about democracy? Your party continues to question elections, undermine trust in our institutions. That's not patriotism, that's sabotage. Karoline turned to him slowly. Questioning power is the foundation of democracy. Trust is earned, not demanded. You don't restore faith by silencing people who ask questions. You restore it by answering them. If your institutions can't handle scrutiny, maybe they're not worth defending. He tried to reply, but she wasn't finished. You said questioning elections undermines democracy. But what did your side do in 2016? Russian collusion hoaxes, resistance movements, impeachment threats before Trump ever took office. You didn't just question legitimacy, you denied it. And now you clutch your pearls because we're playing by the rules you rewrote. The host leaned in again, his voice almost pleading now. But Karoline, don't you see where this leads? The anger, the division, the extremism, it's escalating. Don't you worry it'll consume everything? Her answer was slow and devastating. I worry more about what happens when everyone stops talking. When we all agree out of fear, not belief. when silence replaces conflict, not because we've healed, but because we've been forced to our knees. That's not peace. That's submission. Another pause, longer than the last. The studio felt hollow now, like a church just emptied of its congregation. You could hear every shift, every shallow breath. Somewhere in the back, a technician accidentally dropped a pen. The sound echoed. Karoline leaned back at last, her first moment of rest. But it wasn't retreat, it was declaration. Her gaze moved slowly across the room, meeting eyes one by one. You ask why I speak this way. It's because millions of Americans can't. They're afraid of being fired, of being censored, of being labeled hateful for simply believing what their parents taught them, what their faith teaches them, what their eyes can still see. They write me letters, send me messages, whisper in airports and diners and town halls. They say, "Don't stop. You're saying what we all wish we could say out loud." The journalist shook his head but said, "Nothing." The professor stared blankly at his own notes. The younger panelist had tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from something closer to rage, or perhaps confusion. Because everything they had prepared, every argument, every angle, had crumbled under the weight of conviction that did not flinch. And Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She just sat in the moment, as if the silence was part of her plan all along. The red light on the camera blinked again. Another segment was ending, but there was still one left. One final exchange before the curtain would fall, and Karoline was ready to finish what she started. As the final segment returned from commercial, there was a hush that settled even deeper than before, an unspoken understanding that the usual script had been burned, its ashes scattered somewhere between Karoline's first sentence and now. The host's voice returned to the airwaves, but it had lost its anchor. The cadence was forced, the words brittle. "We're back for our final thoughts," he said, eyes downcast, no longer seeking control but simply survival. "Karoline, you've certainly made your perspective clear. But in the spirit of reflection, what would you say to those watching tonight who feel afraid of your words, who see them as a threat to progress?" She turned toward the camera once more, the studio forgotten, the panelists just shadows at the edge of her voice. She spoke not to them, but to the millions watching, those across kitchen tables and dorm room beds, in break rooms and on cracked couches, those who had never spoken but had always known. I would say this. I understand your fear. I know what it's like to be told you're wrong for simply thinking differently. I know what it's like to question the narrative and wonder if you're the only one left who still believes in the foundation of this country. But hear me now. You are not alone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You've been told that silence is safety, that agreement is virtue, that submission is love. But real love speaks the truth. Real courage stands when it's easier to kneel. And real freedom is never bought with comfort. It's won through conviction. She looked directly into the lens as if reaching through it. They call it hate when you speak. They call it ignorance when you question. They say you're dangerous because you remember how things used to be, when parents raised their children. Not the state, when facts weren't filtered through politics, when being American meant something deeper than just geography. She took a breath, and for a moment, the studio didn't exist. There was only her voice. They want to shame you into silence, to erase your faith, your traditions, your voice, to tell you that progress only marches in one direction, and if you aren't walking with them, you're an enemy. But you don't owe your loyalty to fear. You owe it to truth. The host shifted slightly, eyes glassy now. He had stopped taking notes, stopped steering. You're not extremists. You're not radicals. You're parents, veterans, farmers, teachers, workers. You're the thread holding this nation together, while the loudest voices rip at the seams. And I'm here to say, don't let them shame you. Don't let them silence you. Because the America they want us to forget still lives inside every person brave enough to speak. She paused, not for effect, but because what came next was something she had carried for years. I will never apologize for loving this country, for wanting my children to grow up with the same freedoms that built it, for saying that liberty isn't outdated, that faith isn't hatred, that truth isn't whatever the mob says it is today. And if that makes me dangerous in their eyes, then so be it. The red light turned off, but no one moved. The silence was unbearable now, not because of discomfort, but because it was sacred. The host cleared his throat. "Thank you, Karoline," he said slowly, each syllable weighed down. "That's all the time we have tonight?" She nodded once, didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just stood, thanked the crew with a soft, "Appreciate you," and walked off the set like a soldier stepping out of a battlefield she never intended to win, but refused to lose. Behind her, the panelists remained seated, quiet, still processing what had just happened. Across the country, televisions faded to credits, but people didn't change the channel. They sat, they thought, they remembered, and in that space between the broadcast and the aftermath, a single voice had cut through the noise, not with fury, but with clarity, not with politics, but with truth, and it echoed long after the lights went dark.